What's the similarity between the recent Spider-Man game, which is an action-adventure game, and Terraria, a 2D sandbox game without a story? Well, it's the one simple game design technique that they both use, and it can be summarized in one very simple word: storytelling. It's pretty obvious how Spider-Man uses an engaging story to hook players, but games like Terraria, Mario Wonder, Potato, even Roller Coaster Tycoon, and many others don't have a story at all, and they still use this game design technique that revolves entirely around storytelling. And how is this possible? Well, I'm going to go through 5 different games and explain exactly how they use this principle of storytelling-inspired design, even if they don't have a story to speak of, or if they do, how they use this approach outside of it. After all of that, I'll give an important piece of context that you also really need to keep in mind if you want to apply any of this. Otherwise, it might not work, but if you do apply it, I guarantee you your games will become much better. I've actually put it to use in 2 of my games, and instantly, both the reviews and average playtime went up. Before I go into the non-story applications of storytelling-inspired design, first we have to establish a baseline, and that is, what makes a story interesting? Why do games that have a good story engage you more, and how do they actually do that? Well, it's about 2 simple things: anticipation and payoff. Stories have beats, and if you're interested enough in knowing what the next one is, you'll keep on playing the game, right? And to achieve this, writers make use of several techniques. Like, one simple example is they may use foreshadowing to make you want to know what they're insinuating, or inevitable clashes between characters that you're really eagerly awaiting. So speaking of engaging stories, now we get to the part of the video where I explain how all of this relates to Mario Wonder. So what the heck does anything that I just said have to do with this game that has one of the most basic stories in modern gaming? Well, let's look at the sequence that takes place close to the beginning of the game. The camera pans over to the first castle and reveals Bowser Jr. Ignore the dialogue, it's completely irrelevant even though we're talking about storytelling. But so, what goes through the mind of the player in this moment? Probably, what's this castle level like, right? It's the first one, you've never seen one in this game yet. And that is the key. I don't mean that the dialogue boxes are doing anything storytelling related. What I'm referring to is that the game is building anticipation when you see the castle, and then you have this goal in mind throughout the whole world, and then bam, when you reach it, there's a payoff, and you see what it's all about. This is not the cleverest part of this approach though in regards to Mario Wonder. That comes right after you beat the castle level. It sounds simple, but the fact that a new world with new mechanics and graphics is what comes right after this is genius. Just imagine this. You're playing through a world, anticipating what the boss is like, then you beat it, you get thrown into a crazy new world with lots of new stuff, and before you know it, you're wondering what the next castle level is like, and the cycle repeats. And I know what you're thinking. This sounds great. It's basically a cycle of anticipation and payoff, the same technique that storytellers use to keep you engaged. But how do you actually apply this to a game that doesn't have a level select? The beginning of Elden Ring is amazing. You go through this little tutorial cave, use an elevator, and straight away you see a giant tree and a pretty cool looking castle, both of which are notable enough to start building anticipation. But, the castle is more easily accessible, so you start going there, but it takes quite a long time to get there, and throughout the whole journey, your heart is beating with anticipation because you want to know what there actually is. Then you get to it, and you see the first major boss fight of the game, Margit. Once you defeat it, you feel such a huge payoff, but straight away, a path ahead opens to the first major dungeon of the game. This is literally the same exact cycle that the Mario Wonder example I used did, anticipation and then payoff. But you might be wondering, how do you apply this storytelling technique of anticipation and payoff to a game that has, randomly generated content? Potato is a super simple game. You basically run around in a box, choose upgrades, and beat up enemies. But what might surprise you is that the storytelling technique is also applied here. When you launch the game, you're greeted with a bunch of lock icons for the characters, and this is basically a form of foreshadowing. So again, storytelling-inspired design. So you know how many characters there are and how to get them, which kind of gives you a hint as to what they do, but you don't actually know for sure. So what most players do is pick a character to try to unlock, do their quest or achievement, and once they succeed, they have the payoff to be able to play with it. But since every time you start a run, you see all of the locked characters, you still want to see what they're about, and the cycle continues. I like to call this way of building anticipation and payoff visible rewards, because it kind of creates tension by allowing you to see kind of what you're going to get, but the desire to actually try it is the payoff, and the inkling of knowledge of the reward makes it all the more enticing. Another way to do this, beyond a quest-like system, is to do skill trees, kind of like in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where there are little upgrades that have minor improvements to your character, but those always lead to something more major like a game-changing ability. In doing this, you use a more traditional reward dripping technique, but you also get the storytelling styled payoff at the end and a direct track to the next reward. The pattern here between all of the examples so far has been that as soon as a major reward has been given to you, you instantly have a new reward to strive for. The reward for the anticipation is not only the payoff, it's also more anticipation. So if you're going to take anything away from this video, there's this and there's a second thing. The second thing comes later, but for the first thing, I'm going to repeat it again. The reward for anticipation is not only the payoff, it's also more anticipation. But you might be wondering, if a game doesn't have complex progression systems or handmade level design, how do you keep players engaged? If you haven't played Terraria before, it's kind of like 2D Minecraft, but with much more emphasis on combat, bosses, and gear progression. The thing is, your character doesn't level up or have a skill tree, so how do you get rewarded when you defeat a special boss, and how do you even know what to do after you beat that boss? Well, Terraria has two things that it does incredibly well. Let me explain the first one because it's a prerequisite to understanding the second one. Whenever you beat a boss in the game, you can receive two kinds of main rewards. Weapons, which make your character stronger because the weapons have better stats, but then you also get materials. And you may think that the weapons are what's most important here, since they allow you to take on tougher bosses and so you can progress that way, but that's not it at all. The reality is that the materials are the key to the Genie's progression system. What's interesting about Terraria is that the bosses unlock in layers. Usually you're given a pool of them that you can battle, and once you defeat all of them or a portion of them, you can go fight a new pool. The way in which you unlock that new pool is not through just defeating all of the lower level bosses, it's often got to do with some sort of grind. So what you do is you have to refight the bosses to get all the relevant materials to craft a key item, and while you're doing that, you're getting other materials to craft weapons and armor that make your stats stronger. So your anticipation swells as you get closer and closer to your goal, and once you do, you get your payoff, and then what happens? How does the game give you even more anticipation after the payoff? Well, it's got to do with the second thing that I was alluding to earlier, and that's this game's level design. Whenever you look for materials to progress, you always end up stumbling across a notable landmark, and usually these are either completely locked until you can craft the relevant thing to unlock it, or there's a boss with such high stats that you can't really defeat it yet. And what's genius about this, in conjunction with the crafting system, is that once you do have the ability to enter these areas, you already know exactly where they are and what you need to be able to access them. So the second layer of anticipation that comes with the payoff is a result of the good level design that the world generation algorithm creates. And what's interesting is that in practice, all of this creates a very similar effect to the Assassin's Creed skill tree, where you keep on getting small rewards along your journey with one big one at the end. I mentioned at the start of the video that there was a quite important qualifier, right? Well, it's the one that I wish that I had known myself before designing two of my games, because it would have made my life much easier. But before I go into that though, I wanted to mention that both of these games that I made are on discount, and you can get them together in a bundle for just $570, and it's actually at a discount right now if you're watching the video, so go get it now. It's an absolute steal. So about the qualifier, the first of my games is called Soulstalker, and it's a roguelike with inspirations from both Slay the Spire and Brotato. But a problem that I had early on in early access was that the game had no progression system at all. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, it's obvious that I should have had one, right? But initially, I was trying to make a game that was more like Slay the Spire, where it was super strategy based, and it's still like that, but it turns out that it didn't really matter because the player base was closer to something like Vampire Survivors. So the first thing that you have to know to properly apply all of this advice is what kinds of things actually engage your players. If you're making a strategic game and your players don't like strategy, you're in a bit of a problem. It's the same problem as if you're making a movie and using the tension of a scary moment to engage people, but that won't work if your audience is people who don't really like that at all. It'll just make them not want to watch the movie. Fortunately for the game, it's in early access, so I just added a progression system afterwards, and that seemed to help a ton, and it even increased the average playtime. My second game, called Wanted Shadows, is also a roguelike, and I had the complete opposite issue as Soulstalker. This one launched with a progression system, but it was not very well tuned, so people unlocked everything really quickly. So the second thing that you have to know is how much tolerance your players have for anticipation. If they have high tolerance, you can tune your systems to be a bit more grindy, and if they have low tolerance, then you should make them less grindy. The issue with Wanted Shadows was that my players had high tolerance, but I balanced the game as if they had low tolerance. Fortunately, I fixed this in the end, and if I had more experience in the genre, I probably would have known not to make this mistake in the first place. Earlier in this video, I said that there was two main takeaways, and I explained the first one, but the second that I hope this video has shown is that you can take strategic approaches from different mediums like film, literature, and maybe even others to inspire your game design. I think that really understanding why something works is the key to being able to modify it and create something fresh and new. There's a reason why so many game developers value interests in other fields that are not game development. Also, if you want to try to avoid the mistakes that I made, the best way to do that is to get tons of targeted practice. And you do that by making many games super fast. So if you want to learn how to do that, watch this video where I go over the method that I used to make Wanted Shadows and release it on Steam in just 2 weeks. Other than that, I hope this video was super helpful, and I'll see you all for the next one.